Jeff, you could put a billion monkeys with typewriters in a room, and they would have not ever conjured up the story that RFK Jr. was responsible for the dead bear cub in Central Park 10 years ago.
It's a fantastic story.
All you timeless children with your predictions and flashbacks, trying to get ahead. What makes you think I can see you? What makes you think I believe you? Dreams inside my bed. Have you heard me lately? We were stepping up waiting, shot from the past. All the dreams will fly and all the thoughts will die.
Get right to it, because I got to give you major kudos. In fact, ringing the bell for you. You had a real, you're the person responsible for my awareness of Tim Walz in the VP market. So when we jump into that, I'm going to give you all the appropriate kudos. So ready when you are.
Well, it has been another interesting week here in politics. The last time that we spoke, we were in the final days of winnowing the search for Kamala Harris's vice presidential pick. And over the weekend, the reporting came down to, I believe, the three people that you and I were talking about most. One, Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, Mark Kelly, senator from Arizona, and Tim Walz, the governor from Minnesota. They all fit the criteria: more moderate, middle-aged white men, if we want to be serious about what the criteria were for the pick. Not necessarily harmful, not necessarily going to outshine Kamala. And Walz appears to have been the person that bested all of the criteria connected with Vice President Harris and now Democratic Party nominee officially for the 2024 slate. But Jeff, that is the market that we need to turn our attention to, because this has been perhaps the most interesting market, although it is currently not up on the board right now. The fact of the matter is, in recent days, we've seen wild, dramatic swings in betting markets. Tim Walz a few days ago was trading just under 15 cents. Josh Shapiro yesterday morning was looking like the favorite at one point, up at 63 cents. But things changed very, very quickly. Jeff, I didn't have any skin in the game on a VP pick, and I know that you've been trading in out of those markets.
Yes.
So let's explore what you did and, quite frankly, how you felt that you handled this, given the news flow and all the conflicting information. Are you satisfied with the bets that you placed, or do you feel like you may have been able to do something differently?
Well, you never regret what could have been, so I won't go there, but I don't mind walking through it because, you know, we were pretty transparent in the last time we were together. I was looking at some of the comments on YouTube and in the chats as to, no, it'll never be, you know, what people thought might happen and what ended up playing out. As our listeners might recall, I was long Tim Walz from 3 cents. Now, that sounds like a great story right there, because I bought Tim Walz at 3 cents. And remember, these are binary options. They trade between 1 cent and 99 cents, and they settle either at 0 or $1, depending on the outcome. That's how prediction markets work invariably. Buying at 3 cents means if that's the outcome, it'll settle at $1, and you have a 33x return. So I was all in with the maximum bet that predicted was allowed, and I had ridden that up. But I sold Tim Walz. My highest print on my sell was 31. But that was only for a fraction. I peeled off shares as he was rising. I did not see Tim Walz as the ultimate selection, and maybe because he wasn't on my radar initially. All kudos to Tim Walz goes to you, because you brought that name to my attention. What I had right at the outset was I made money on Mark Kelly and rode him up, and I was always short Josh Shapiro. The one thing I was convinced about was that the front runner in the market was not going to be the ultimate selection as nominee. And that proved out to be true, and we can talk about those reasons why. But Tim Walz was a name that, to this day, only 75% of America knows who he is. But you brought him to my attention. That's why I was in at 3 cents, and, you know, have at least a 10x to attribute to you at the top end. That wasn't my average return, but it averaged 5x on that trade easily. And that's kind of the fun of the prediction markets, is that kind of fast-moving long shot opportunity.
Can I actually give you a funny anecdote there about Tim Walz?
Yeah.
I was flagged Tim Walz by a friend who ran against Dylan Ratigan for Congress a few years ago.
No kidding. No kidding. I didn't know that. That's interesting. That's really
That's
funny.
how the name came in my plate. Talking with people in mid-July, I said, what are the names here? And this guy says Tim Walz. And sure enough, he's the pick. And this is someone who, incidentally, my first up-close experience with Dylan Ratigan, not from the just viewing standpoint of seeing him on MSNBC, Bloomberg, Bill Maher, but from oh, this is someone who I need to help a friend prepare for. Like, a small world. Anyway, kudos to my friend Patrick Nelson for that.
Very funny because, Tim Walz is not a household name by any means. And,
no, not at all.
And it's very, very clear that he ended up on the short list because of the personal relationship that he has with Harris. They're pretty chummy, but not that he's not a qualified candidate in his own right. So let's talk a little bit more about him, what you think he has done for the ticket. I'd like to, maybe give you my thoughts on that as well, but what's your take? How do you assess that? Because clearly the markets, and I wouldn't say it's the selection of Tim Walz, it's been the confluence of number of events over the last couple of days that has also flipped the main market of Trump v. Harris, where across Predicted and Polymarket and Betfair in the UK, Harris is now the front runner in the prediction markets, and that hasn't been the case at all until the past 10 days.
No, it hasn't been. And actually, that's something that we flagged in last week's episode, that there was this potential arbitrage opportunity in the markets itself, where Predicted was giving, Vice President Harris somewhere around a 50% chance. When you look to other betting markets, she was still sitting well into the 40s. So if you had the ability to play both, you could look for a convergence, effectively selling Kamala in the Predicted market and buying her back elsewhere, as those odds would ultimately converge over time. And it's starting to feel like we're getting to a place where, if you've been riding the coattails of the long Harris trade for the past few weeks, I think in the next 2 weeks, it's probably going to hit a near-term peak, where Kamala is going to reach her max betting odds for perhaps the rest of the cycle, or at least for a few weeks going into September. Jeff, I would want to remind people of the dynamics of this market, where we started when Biden dropped out. Kamala was looking at, a 34% chance of winning?
That's right.
Trump was sitting at 66 cents.
That's right.
I made the case that at the time, people shouldn't pay much attention to where the polls stood, because those are static snapshots of how people feel at any given moment in time. And having not been the nominee, she would generate a lot of earned media simply by being at the top of the ticket. And she would talk and campaign in ways that she couldn't do as vice president, obviously, so as not to overshadow Biden when he was the top of the ticket. And naturally, that's occurred. People can say it's about media bias, or the media is only showing the good vibes coming from the campaign, and thus, another propaganda arm effort of the DNC. Or this is just typically how things work historically, where if a candidate comes onto the scene, people pay attention to them, they learn about them, and their polling just tends to go up, Democrat or Republican. That's history. The fact that the announcement was made on the heels of the Republican convention deprived the Trump-Vance ticket of the oxygen they would have received otherwise in what is a typical 2% polling bump in the 2 weeks following the convention. So Kamala gets that instead. And now she's riding this with Walz up into the convention, which is in just a few days' time. And then likely you're going to see her polling averages peak in the week or two thereafter. That's when I think the betting market gets into probably a 60 or 65 cent range. And then you're probably sitting at fair value, because then the market tends to tighten up in terms of polling from Labor Day onward. Everyone really starts to pay attention to politics Labor Day onward. So if I've been writing this up for the past few weeks, it goes from 40 to 60. I've basically done 50% on my initial bet in a few weeks' time. That's a great return on your investment for the short window in which you've operated. Take some off the table. Let's look for the next bet.
Well, as an active prediction market trader who's traded through 2 general election and 2 midterm cycles, I would completely agree with that analysis. That's the typical pattern, is that Harris will peak about a week or two after the convention. And then we'll start to see a regression back to the mean. At that point, it'll become a tighter race. Remember, Nate Silver now is clearly, among the front runners of the pollsters that's most highly regarded in the country. And he does have her leading right now in the general election, but there'll be a much more narrow focus looking at the swing states going forward, because that's where this game is going to be played in a handful of states, predominantly 3. But if you want to go broader, in 8 different states, when you go outside of Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, you include some other states. But as we start to focus in on the swing states in general, this thing will tighten up completely. So there is an opportunity to begin shorting Harris again at that point and expect a regression to the mean, and then peel back and sit back and wait for the October surprises. Now, let me ask you another question, though, because I'm curious, because
Sure.
You were so right about Walz. And even though the whole point of the prediction trade, we've done 4 seasons of this, and it's never been about political opinions. It's about political probabilities, because
Correct.
opinions really don't matter in this. But I personally, and maybe I feel burned, because even though I made money long Walz, long Kelly for a while and short Shapiro. I certainly didn't say the 33X had I held it all the way. I did not, it reminds me of what used to be one of my favorite trades was I was so proud of the fact that I bought Bitcoin at 100, but sold it at 300. I'm like, oh, a 3X, that's fantastic. That was a great trade back then. That's what this Tim Walz trades reminds me of, because it reminds me of what could have been. But getting to the opinion side, and since you are a Politico, I don't mind, kind of asking you this question. I personally was not a fan of the Vance pick because I didn't think it advanced the ticket in the way that Rubio or Gabbard might have. I thought, or Virginia, I'm blanking on his name for a second, Virginia Youngkin, or as Youngkin would have. In the same way, Minnesota is not a state that's really in play. Or if it is in play, if it comes down to Minnesota, the Dems have already lost the general election, because if Minnesota's in play, that means they lost Wisconsin and Michigan. So,
well, the context being there that no Republicans won Minnesota on the presidential level in 50 years.
Exactly. Right. So that being the case, I don't think it adds that much to the ticket. I think both picks were red meat thrown to their bases. Now, I know that those with a liberal perspective are considering Walz a moderate, but that's not how independents and the other side of the equation see Walz, right? They see him as a red meat pick in the same way that Vance was. I'm just curious, what's your take on it?
When Tim Walz was in Congress, based on the legislation that he sponsored and co-sponsored as a congressman, he ranked as one of the top 15 most moderate Democrats. On a sliding scale comparing congressman ideologies, the Republican that ranks closest to Tim Walz during his tenure in Congress is former Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. So I don't know if we can paint Tim Walz's political career as being a far left person. How he's governed as governor of Minnesota is different, however, of course. I don't know if we call him a progressive or a leftist. He seems like he's very effective. He's pragmatic. He had a 0-seat majority in the Minnesota legislature this most recent term, something that we talked about last week, and he was able to push through a lot of bills. Whether or not you agree with the policies or not, if you have a 0-vote majority and you are able to get done a whole host of issues, it means that you're clearly able to find common ground with people and compromise. And so that bone of bipartisanship that existed in his congressional days, while it may not be apparent in the governor level because, well, as governor, he's basically signed in all the Democratic priorities that have been there. Democratic, or rather Minnesota politics are different. It's not just Dems and Republicans. There's Labor Party, there's a Farmers Party. So balancing all those interests takes a lot of work. So I think in terms of executive leadership, he brings a lot to the ticket. But there are holes, right? There are shortcomings for him. I've already seen, the Swift boat comparisons to what happened to John Kerry in 2004, because ironically enough, the person who's running the Trump campaign these days, Chris LaCivita, was the architect of the John Kerry Swift boat ads back in 2004.
Which proved to be very effective.
Which were very effective. And so, given that Governor Walz left the National Guard, which seems to be a legitimate health concern, he lost his hearing and it required surgery. Nevertheless, you're going to hear probably claims of stolen valor. So is it a perfect pick? No. Are there things for Republicans to chew at and pick on? Yes. But in terms of do no harm, that's probably the single most important criteria for vice president. Do no harm. That's why Josh Shapiro likely wasn't picked. The harm that he would have done is that he would have been angling for the Oval the entire time. You're not going to choose a vice president who you think is trying to take your job and look for weakness to stab you in the back. And Jeff, to make a final point here, I'm not surprised that it's not Shapiro, because if you really have presidential ambitions, why on earth would you want to be on this ticket of all tickets? We've been making the point here on the prediction trade that this is a burn year.
That's the Newsom argument, right?
That's the Newsom argument. That's the J.B. Pritzker argument. That's the Gretchen Whitmer argument. That is the Josh Shapiro argument.
That's right.
If you lose to Trump here, Democrats eat their own. Find me a person who was at the top of the ticket in the last 40 years that got a second bite of the apple. That was president or vice president. Just doesn't happen. Gore didn't get another shot. Kerry didn't, right? Clinton hasn't.
Yep.
Tim Kaine, no.
Now, of course, the irony is this election will probably come down to Pennsylvania. And I think it was somebody in the New York Times said today, when you're in Pennsylvania and you're down by 10,000 votes, you'd be thinking, why didn't I pick Josh Shapiro? To question that.
But that's the dynamic.
Josh Shapiro,
right?
Even though front runner, and by the way, being someone who really respects the accuracy of the prediction markets, because they have been uncannily accurate relative to polling in recent years, and that's a common academic comparison you'll see in a number of white papers. But this was one they got wrong. They got Vance right, and it didn't seem like a smart pick. The prediction markets got Josh Shapiro wrong because he was the front runner all along. And a long shot, a dark horse, a 3-cent Tim Walz came in to take that over. But going back to the other points, his vulnerabilities are probably going to be the clip of his wife talking about rolling down the windows, the smell of the rubber burning,
the riots,
in the Minnesota riots, right? And maybe an overly restrictive approach during COVID lockdowns. So he's going to have some vulnerabilities, and that's the reason. All that matters in this race, obviously, is what the middle thinks and what the middle and 8 states think, and the extent to which the GOP paints him as a partisan, as a progressive, will be what determines that outcome. Then there's always the Trump thinking, which was pretty funny to say right after he picked his vice president pick, was that, well, VP picks really don't matter anyways. So we'll see if that's the case.
But he's not wrong about that, right? VP picks really do not matter, which is why the general rule of thumb is do no harm. If they're going to help, they're going to help perhaps in their home state. And that is the, criticism here. Pennsylvania is arguably the most important state in this battlefield. If Trump wins Pennsylvania and he carries all of the other states that he carried, he just needs to peel back one of Arizona or Georgia to win, right?
Well,
so if Democrats can keep the math matters.
Yeah. Do no harm, though, has the benefit of hindsight, because
of course
at the front end of the Sarah Palin pick, it's kind of an interesting pick. She was a woman. It was a new name. She had a fresh face. She had a great backstory, and nobody knew that she could see Russia from her kitchen at that point. So, some of that do no harm comes out, over time. So we'll see how that plays out. But let's go back to the main premise as to where the opportunities are going forward. You're right.
Yes.
Things are getting wide right now. And I think you've perfectly identified the natural cadence here, is that Harris will continue to show strength. She'll get the post-convention bounce, probably look like a couple points. And then that's the time that you look for a regression back and this race to tighten up in the prediction markets at that point.
To me, this is really no different than when you look to a financial market and you see overcrowded positioning. I'm kind of reminded of what happened at the end of May 2023, beginning of June 23, when we avoided the debt ceiling debate. And you had entered June with one of the largest net short positions in history in the futures market for the S&P 500. So just by function of those shorts being covered and closed, stock prices were likely to rise, given how positioning has impacted flows before. And I kind of feel like that's how it's been here now. There are certain structural issues, like Kamala not being the nominee and her now getting the benefit of the convention ahead, that have catered to this tailwind to allow her odds to rise, while circumstantially undercutting what should have been natural organic boost for Trump. This is not me thinking that she's going to win the election, but how is the betting market and the probabilities, how have they shifted, and how will they continue to shift moving forward? So is this the time right now to fade Harris? Why is it not now? More polls are coming out that are moving in her direction, according to Real Clear Politics, where they do a good job aggregating all of the polls. If it's in Wisconsin or for the general, if it's across a variety of states, we're seeing here in recent days that the polls are moving more and more in Harris's direction. Again, not to be unexpected. So if you want to fade this and look for the race to get back to where it really should be priced, right? Where would the market theoretically price on November 1st? Closer to 50-50.
Right. Well, let's take a look at that list one more time, a little slower, and let's focus in on the swing states, because that's where the race is, right? So here's Wisconsin, swing state, still tight, right? Harris up 1 or 2. Let's see.
Georgia getting tighter.
Georgia getting tighter, right? Pennsylvania, Trump up 1
or 2 points. Arizona.
Yeah.
Ohio. Can't believe this was a swing state in my lifetime. 10 points for her. But then you go here. Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada. Harris, tie, Harris, Harris.
I haven't seen
Trump
that Michigan. I'm seeing that
Exactly.
Michigan print for the first time. That's Morning Consult is a tier 1 poll. That's a wide margin in Michigan. And that's a really good number for Harris.
It's not necessarily that Trump's odds are going to rise back. There is the working theory that you had all these double haters out there in the world that didn't like Trump, that didn't like Biden. Once Biden drops out, you then have single haters out there. And so Trump is probably at more or less a ceiling right now. As more people come to know the Harris-Walz ticket, you're going to find that more people are going to lose the veneer of the honeymoon phase, and some of these odds will come back in. But that's going to take some time, right? Polling takes 2 to 3 weeks to, what happens today really isn't digested in the polling. We won't know it for a week or two out. So we have to be patient on these things, Jeff. But what are the next moves? We just had resolution and closure of the VP pick with Walz settling at $1. So when we look back at the presidency, I have to say there's one thing that really interests me here to keep an eye on in the short term, and it's the three related markets. 2024 presidential election winner. Which party wins the presidency? Will Harris be the 47th president? Ignoring this one down here for the moment, because there is that unique outcome where Harris could become the 47th president, Biden resigns or passes away while in office, and then Harris goes on to lose the election. So she becomes 47, but she's not 48. So this could resolve yes. These other two could resolve no.
Take a look at, flip over to that market that Biden resigns.
Biden resigns.
I think it was around 18 cents or around 18% last time. 15. Okay.
15 now, and it had reached a peak closer to what, 25 cents?
Sure. Right.
30 cents back in the middle of July. But I would be keeping an eye on that, though, Jeff, because if you see it, because one of these markets has embedded into it the third parties. Where did that go?
So, quick note on the third parties. I know we're running out of time here, but rumor has it that Predicted.org is going to be throwing up a market shortly as to what percentage of the popular vote that the third parties, the non-two main parties, end up getting. I think that'll be a very interesting market. I wish it was up right now because those numbers would have shifted a little bit, perhaps after the bear just was dropped in the woods, by RFK. But that could be a fun market to watch as well.
Jeff, you could put 1 billion monkeys with typewriters in a room, and they would have not ever conjured up the story that RFK Jr. was responsible for the dead bear cub in Central Park 10 years ago.
It's a fantastic story. It's one of the most underappreciated stories of this past week, but there was a lot going on. So one thing,
and the fact that he broke the news to Roseanne Barr, this is just
how about it? Right.
It was an amazing sequence of events.
I have a plug, by the way, for listeners. Tomorrow, Luckbox Magazine is launching something new, a weekly newsletter, just once a week, but it'll be a weekly news magazine. We'll talk about prediction markets as well, and of course everything else. This week is really going to be focused on recession risk and volatility and what we learned from Monday's sell-off. That's at getluckbox.com. It's free. Subscribe over there.
Jeff, it was great to speak with you again this week for this latest edition of the Prediction Trade, August 7th, 2024. We'll be back same time, same place next week here on Tasty Live every Wednesday, 4:30 p.m. Eastern, 3:30 Central. For Jeff Joseph, I've been Chris Vecchio. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, always wager responsibly, believe in math, master your trade, and join us next time on the Prediction Trade. Up next, Macro Money with Ilya Spivak.